I sat by the window in a classroom at Shirshi Third High School, propping my chin up with one hand. My name is Hua Ling. It was the first day of my senior year, and I was watching the chaos around me with a bored stare. My classmates were still suffering from a holiday hangover, acting like school hadn't even started yet. "Hey, what did you do over the break? You got so dark," my seatmate asked, leaning over after messing around with some other guys. He looked at me with genuine surprise. "I was carrying bricks," I said simply. My family wasn't well off. Both my parents were ordinary factory workers, and their meager wages had to support 5 of us, including my 2 younger brothers. Life was a constant struggle. Since I was already a senior, I'd spent my summer working as a laborer on a construction site to help out with the bills. "You actually carried bricks?" he asked, eyes wide. "What else? Look at these muscles." I pulled up my sleeve and flexed. My arm was thick and defined, a direct result of a summer spent hauling heavy loads. "Man, that's impressive," he said, reaching out to feel my arm with a look of envy. Then his voice dropped to a whisper. "You want to know where I went?" I leaned back against the desk, my eyes half closed. I knew this guy. If he sat a certain way, I knew if he was about to brag or complain. Right now, he was definitely ready to show off. If I didn't let him finish, he'd probably explode from the pressure. "Where to?" I asked lazily. "My dad signed me up for a wilderness survival camp. I trained for a month. I feel like I'm incredibly strong now," he said, a huge grin spreading across his face. "So, you're getting ready to head to the spirit realm?" I shifted my position, leaning my head against the wall and teasing him. "You bet. Once I successfully complete the awakening, I'll be your big brother. I'll make sure you're taken care of," he said, waving his hand grandly. "Sure. I'll be waiting," I replied. "What about you? We're supposed to prepare for awakening this semester. You want to go together?" he asked. "Me? We'll see," I said, closing my eyes to end the conversation. As I drifted off into my own thoughts, the word awakening echoed in my mind. It was a term that had only existed for about 300 years. Before that, our world, Blue Star, was a desert of the supernatural, a place where magic didn't exist. But then, an accident happened. Blue Star was captured by the spirit realm. The spirit realm is a vast, terrifyingly powerful world. As Blue Star drifted closer to it, supernatural elements began to pour into our world like water flowing downhill. Space rifts and planar tunnels opened up, allowing humans to cross over, and allowing the creatures from the spirit realm to invade us. It was both a revolution and a catastrophe. Ordinary humans stood little chance against the supernatural creatures of the spirit realm. We only survived because the great will of the spirit realm seemed to welcome new worlds. Ancient legacies and supernatural powers flowed into Blue Star, and with a mix of technology and this new magic, we managed to hold our ground. Eventually, our ancestors invented the awakening. Because Blue Star was still being transformed by the spirit realm's energy, humans couldn't change naturally. They discovered that if you went deep into the spirit realm, captured its essence, and brought it back, you could accelerate a person's infection with supernatural factors. Once the levels were high enough, the spirit realm would capture that person and transport them back. If you were lucky, the dense mana there would trigger an awakening. Your body would transform from a mundane shell into a vessel for power. Only those captured by the spirit realm this way could truly evolve. If you just walked through a portal, you lost the chance to transform forever. It was like a carp jumping over the dragon gate. If you made it, you were no longer ordinary. You could become a warrior, a knight, a mage, or a wizard. The world was now divided into 2 classes, the transcendent and the mundane. For the mundane, life was a dead end. You worked, you ate, you survived, and you hoped your children might one day be lucky enough to awaken. The classroom suddenly went quiet. I looked up and saw our homeroom teacher standing at the podium. He looked at us and nodded, seemingly satisfied. "Students, we've been together for 3 years, and the time to part has finally come," he said, his voice grave. "This semester is the fork in the road for your destinies. Class monitor, pass these out." The monitor started handing out sheets of paper. I looked down at mine. It was titled, Shirshi Third High School Awakening Application Form. "Take these home and talk to your parents," the teacher continued. "If you want to participate in the awakening, fill it out and bring it back tomorrow." It isn't safe, and success isn't guaranteed. That's why the state doesn't force it. It had been 300 years. The most dangerous times were over. Now, people from the Great Xia Federation were exploring and looting the spirit realm like the explorers of the old age of discovery. Ordinary people saw it as their only chance to change their social class. The government didn't teach us much about the spirit realm early on. Resources were limited, and the top of the pyramid was already crowded. They didn't need more people climbing up. They just needed a fresh crop of supernatural leaks to harvest. That's why they waited until the end of high school to give us the choice. If you wanted to gamble, you studied the spirit realm and played a game with your life as the stake. If you didn't, you stayed a screw in the machine, a worker, a waiter, or an entertainer. The powerful families didn't have to gamble like this. Their kids had better education, better gear, and higher success rates. For most of us, our lives were decided the moment we were born. So, was I going to gamble? I gripped the application form tightly. I knew I had to. Even if it cost me my life, I had to take this one chance. Otherwise, I was destined to live the same life as my parents. And I couldn't accept that. The school bell rang from the highest tower, its deep chime signaling the end of the day. My head teacher didn't linger. He dismissed us immediately, and the classroom erupted into a chaotic scramble as everyone rushed for the door. I didn't wait for the crowd. I grabbed my bag and vaulted out of the side window, hitting the ground running. I had a job to get to. Even though school had started, I couldn't afford to quit my part-time gig as a waiter at a local restaurant. The work was grueling. As a part-timer, I didn't just serve food. I cleared tables, mopped floors, and spent hours hunched over a sink scrubbing grease off dishes. Some kids would say it's too dirty or too tiring. I didn't have that luxury. If I didn't work, I didn't get paid. I worked from 6 in the evening until 11 at night, every single day. The pay was $20 a shift. It wasn't much, but in this economy, it was enough to keep us going. Plus, the restaurant gave me one free meal a day. That alone made it worth it. By the time the restaurant quieted down near midnight, I was exhausted. I packed up some leftover meat dishes that still looked decent. My parents didn't make much, and meat was a rare treat at our table. I figured if I took these home, washed them off, and refried them, my younger brothers could finally have a decent meal. I slipped through the front door of my house after 11. My parents were still awake, sitting in our cramped, dim living room. The moment my mother heard the key turn, she stood up. She rushed over to brush the dust off my clothes, her eyes tired but kind. She took the bag of leftovers from me and headed straight for the kitchen to start cleaning them. My father gestured for me to sit. "Did your teacher give you the form today?" he asked. "Yes, Dad. It's right here." I pulled the application from my bag. I had already filled out my details. Only the parent's signature was missing. My father took the paper. He stared at the dense rows of text for a long time, saying nothing. He lit a cigarette and took a deep, shaky drag. The smoke curled around his face. "Have you really thought this through?" "I have," I said, nodding firmly. Through the haze of smoke, I saw his hand trembling. He wasn't nearly as calm as he was trying to act. Finally, he slammed a heavy hand onto my shoulder and forced a smile. "Good. That's my boy. I believe you'll succeed in the awakening." He signed it. "Go on, get some rest. You have to be up early." I retreated to my room and washed up quickly. As I lay in bed, I could hear the faint, muffled sound of my mother sobbing in the next room. I stared at the ceiling, my heart heavy. I knew why she was crying. The awakening wasn't just a test. It was a gamble with death. Statistically, out of 10 people who attempted it, 3 or 4 would die. Of those who survived, only 1 or 2 would actually succeed in awakening a supernatural constitution. For poor kids like me, it was a desperate leap. If I made it, I'd cross the dragon's gate and change my fate forever. If I failed, I'd just be another body in the dirt. My parents were terrified, but they didn't want their fear to hold me back. I took a deep breath, forced my mind to go blank, and closed my eyes. I needed to be at my best tomorrow. The next morning, the atmosphere at school was electric. Our head teacher stood at the podium, his face grim as he collected our forms. He sorted them into 2 piles. After a long silence, he looked up at us. "I've reviewed your applications," he said. "I'm proud to see that 40 of you have chosen to participate in the awakening. Let's give them a round of applause." The room erupted. The students who had applied sat with flushed faces, their eyes bright with excitement and nerves. The others, the ones who hadn't signed, looked away, their expressions awkward and uneasy. In a class of 90, nearly half of us were choosing to risk our lives. The teacher clapped his hands and led us out of the room. There were some lingering glances back at our old friends, but no one turned around. We followed him to a new classroom. This was our new home. From now on, our lives were split. Our curriculum changed instantly. We dropped the standard subjects. Instead, we were plunged into basics of the spirit realm, physical conditioning, and wilderness survival. The kids staying behind would never learn these things. The awakening was both simple and terrifyingly complex. The simple part? Once we were exposed to the breath of the spirit realm, the realm would sense us. It would tear open a rift in space and swallow us whole. The complex part was the journey. Traveling from Earth to the spirit realm meant crossing infinite space. Many people died before they even arrived, their bodies torn apart by spatial fluctuations. Even if you landed safely, you were at the mercy of luck. You might land in a field of treasures, or you might land right in the jaws of a spirit realm monster. Some unlucky souls were even teleported inside solid rock or into the heart of a volcano. Instant death. That's why our training was so intense. We were being force-fed survival knowledge to tip the scales in our favor. We had to stay in the spirit realm for 3 to 7 days before we could return to Earth. Survival was everything. There's an old saying on Earth: the most vicious murderer on our planet is kinder than the friendliest elf in the spirit realm. In that place, death isn't always the end. There are things far worse than dying. Some creatures view souls as toys, taking pleasure in torturing both spirit and flesh for eternity. To them, we were nothing but fragile, weak prey. For the next few months, my life became a blur of adrenaline and exhaustion. My brain was packed with maps, monster traits, and survival tactics every morning. Every afternoon, I pushed my body to its absolute limit in physical training. I was no longer just a student or a waiter. I was a soldier preparing for a war I might not survive. My days became an endless cycle of sprints, long-distance runs, and brutal combat drills. I pushed myself until my muscles screamed, all to sharpen my survival instincts. I even quit my part-time jobs. I couldn't afford the distraction. The school cafeteria became my sanctuary, providing the nutrition my body desperately needed. I was like a sponge, soaking up every bit of knowledge and every calorie to fuel my transformation. By the end of the semester, I barely recognized myself. The months of training had triggered a massive growth spurt. I stood over 6 feet tall now, packed with lean, functional muscle. I felt powerful, but not bulky. When the final classes ended, we were given a week of rest. It was a time to clear our heads and prepare for what was coming. I threw my bag over my shoulder and started jogging home. It was June 7th, 6:11 p.m. As I ran past a giant outdoor screen, a news broadcast caught my eye. The Federation's 11th massive Spirit Realm military base was officially complete. They were announcing the first wave of legions being deployed. I kept moving, weaving through the crowded streets. Street vendors were shouting, selling meat buns for 3 yuan each. The June heat was brutal. Even at 6 o'clock, the pavement radiated a staggering temperature. I crossed the road, sticking to the shadows of the tall buildings until I reached my neighborhood. A rusted iron archway greeted me with faded letters, Guangming Community. I took the stairs 2 at a time and burst into our 4th-floor apartment. My parents were still at work. One of my younger brothers was at a boarding school, and the other was likely still on his way home from primary school. I opened our old fridge, it had been with us for over a decade, and pulled out some ingredients. In a poor family, the children grow up fast. People call it a compliment, but really, it just means we start working early. If I had a choice, I wouldn't have spent my childhood laboring, but I didn't. By 7, everyone was home. We sat around the small table, eating a simple meal of mapo tofu, stir-fried pork with peppers, and bitter melon with eggs. I'd learned to cook out of necessity, picking up tips from the chefs during my time as a waiter. My father finished his meal first. He set down his chopsticks and looked at me. "Huiling, I bought you something. It's in your room. Go see if it fits." I finished my food quickly and headed to my tiny bedroom. It was so small that between the bed and the desk, there was barely room to stand. On the floor sat a cardboard box. I opened it and felt a lump in my throat. Inside was a high-end stab-proof vest. I checked the brand. This thing cost at least 10,000 yuan. My parents only made 4,000 a month combined, and they had to support my grandparents back home too. This was years of savings. I gripped the vest tightly. It was a gift of love, but my training told me the truth. It was almost useless. Very few things in the spirit realm could be stopped by ordinary armor. If I actually ended up in a real fight, my best move wouldn't be relying on this vest. It would be finding a quick way to kill myself before the monsters could start the torture. The week of rest vanished. After a heavy goodbye to my family, I returned to school. Today was the day of awakening. The campus was chaos. Regular students were sent home, leaving only those of us preparing for the ritual. Expensive cars lined the gates as parents dropped off their kids. Hualing, a voice yelled. I turned to see my desk mate, Rin Jingyang, running toward me. Unlike me, he looked like he was going to war. He was covered in gear. You're wearing a vest too? He asked, spotting the outline under my shirt. Check this out. I've even got the stab-proof pants. He rolled up his trouser leg to show off. His family was middle class, so they could afford the extra protection. He reached into his pack and tossed me a black bag. Here, I got this for you. What's this? I unzipped it. A survival kit. Your big brother Ren is looking out for you. He grinned, his gear clinking as he slapped my shoulder. Inside were sharp knives, a first aid kit, rope, fire-starting tools, and various gadgets. It was a high-quality kit, worth at least 1,000 yuan. Thanks, I said, genuinely grateful. He was a loudmouth, but he was a real friend. Soon, our homeroom teacher gathered us onto a bus. Awakening wasn't something you did in a classroom. It was too dangerous. We were heading to a specialized facility. On the bus, the other students were buzzing with excitement, dreaming of the superpowers they were about to get. The teacher smiled at them, but I saw her expression falter. She knew the statistics. At least half of the students on this bus wouldn't be coming back alive. After 2 hours, we arrived at a remote military base. An entire army battalion was stationed here to guard the site. Students from all 5 high schools in the county were converging, over 3,000 of us in total. We were led into a large hall. The teacher walked to the front holding a crystal ball with 16 facets. Class, this is a simulator for the awakening orb. Watch closely as I demonstrate how to use it. Every eye in the room was glued to her hands. This wasn't just a lesson anymore. This was the moment that would decide our fate. Teacher demonstrated how to use the device quickly. She even passed a fake awakening orb around the room so we could practice the motions. There was still a lot to do before the real thing. The staff began handing out rations, compressed food packs designed to last us 10 days. In the awakening process, the most important thing is staying alive. If a student can find a safe place to hide and make it back in one piece, there's a chance they'll succeed. Even if they don't awaken, coming back alive is a victory in itself. These rations meant we wouldn't have to risk our lives hunting for food in an unknown world. As the preparations wound down, the hall grew quiet. The reality of the life and death struggle ahead finally started to sink in. The earlier excitement vanished. Some of my classmates were visibly shaking, their faces slick with sweat as they shifted restlessly in their seats. Our homeroom teacher watched us, a pained look in his eyes. He clapped his hands loudly to break the tension. All right, you future overhumans. Don't be nervous. Grab your gear. It's time to awaken. We had reached the point of no return. The government had spent a fortune on our training and these facilities. If anyone backed out now, they'd be facing prison time. We followed the teacher out of the classroom in a silent, single-file line. He led us into a massive circular arena. It looked like a sports stadium, but instead of bleachers, the perimeter was lined with small, reinforced rooms. I recognized them immediately from my textbooks. These were the awakening chambers. Each room was about 4 square meters with thick concrete walls. No windows, just a heavy, solid iron door. The awakening process is unpredictable. When a person is transported to the spirit realm and then sent back to Earth, the transition can sometimes leave behind a spatial rift. These cracks in reality can grow or shrink over time. If a rift leads to a relatively safe area, the military takes over and turns it into a permanent base. That's how the Great Qin Dynasty's massive spirit realm outposts were born. But if the other side is too dangerous, the guards use specialized equipment to collapse the rift instantly. It's a necessary precaution to keep Earth safe. I shook those thoughts away as the teacher led me to my assigned chamber. A staff member ushered me inside and slammed the heavy door shut. I heard the lock click into place. I scanned the small space. An awakening orb sat in the center of the floor. Next to it lay a short blade. This was our only government-issued weapon for survival. It wasn't much, but there was a reason for it. Most creatures in the spirit realm are far stronger than us. A short blade is a tool. If a blade can't kill it, a bigger sword probably won't help you either. Firearms were useless there. The spirit realm is saturated with a strange magical energy that alters basic physics and chemistry. Gunpowder doesn't ignite the same way. On Earth, a rifle is a deadly weapon. In the spirit realm, it's just a heavy club. A blade was all I had. The goal wasn't to fight. It was to hide and survive. I checked my backpack and gear one last time. I made sure every strap was tight and every buckle was secure. I didn't want anything falling off during the transition. I tucked the short blade into my belt and picked up the awakening orb. Memories flashed through my mind. I thought of my parents, my classmates, and the dead-end part-time jobs I used to work. I took a deep breath. I refused to stay at the bottom of society forever. With a steady hand, I opened the cover of the orb. A strange, misty aura began to leak out, filling the small room. I sat down and inhaled, letting the magical energy of the spirit realm flow into my lungs. Now, I just had to wait. Once my body was sufficiently infected by this energy, the spirit realm would pull me in. I lay back in a comfortable position, my hand gripped tightly around the hilt of my blade. Time became a blur. Maybe 30 minutes passed, maybe an hour. Suddenly, a spatial rift tore open behind me. A massive suction force took hold, dragging me into the void. The vacuum was so intense it even sucked the dust off the floor before the rift snapped shut. I felt nothing as I tumbled through the darkness. There was no sense of time. 1 second, I was in a concrete room on Earth, and the next, I was being spat out like a piece of trash. I hit the ground and immediately crouched low. My heart was hammering against my ribs. These transitions are dangerous. Some people arrive in the spirit realm as nothing more than a pile of severed limbs. I quickly checked my arms and legs. Everything was still attached. Then I felt my backpack. My blood ran cold. The bottom of the bag had been sliced clean off by the spatial rift. Half of my supplies were gone. If that rift had opened just a few inches higher, it wouldn't have been my bag it cut in half. It would have been me. I forced myself to focus and looked around. I was in what looked like a ruined city. Plants had burst through the cracked pavement, and thick vines climbed the sides of crumbling buildings. I drew my blade. I didn't know if my arrival had made any noise, so I couldn't stay put. I moved forward with hushed footsteps, staying low. After walking for a few minutes, I spotted a building that looked structurally sound. It was a street-side apartment complex, maybe 20 or 30 meters tall. The city felt ancient. There were no signs or recognizable writing anywhere. Most of the doors in the hallway were already hanging off their hinges. I stopped in front of one iron door that was still closed. My eyes widened. There was a massive hole right in the center of the metal. The iron had been torn outward, leaving jagged, twisted edges. It looked like the work of a powerful beast. This place wasn't safe, but wandering the open streets was worse. I decided to keep climbing. I needed the high ground to see what I was dealing with. I moved up the stairs, past the silent, broken rooms, searching for a place to hide. I listened closely, but the building was silent. No footsteps, no growls, nothing. For now, I was safe. I found a room on the 3rd floor with the door standing open. Like the others, it had a heavy iron door, mostly intact. I crept inside, moving like a shadow. I set my mangled backpack on the floor and reached for the door to shut it. The hinges groaned. It was old, rusted, and loud. I froze, my heart hammering against my ribs. I didn't dare move it another inch. Leaving the door cracked, I gripped my short blade and began checking the other rooms. I pushed open a wooden door that was slightly ajar. It was a bedroom. There was a rotting wooden bed covered in filth-stained blankets. They were so old they looked like they'd crumble if I breathed on them. I used the tip of my blade to pry open a wardrobe. The clothes inside were ruins. When I touched a sleeve, it turned to dust between my fingers. I backed out and moved to the next door. I pushed it open, and my heart skipped a beat. A skeleton was slumped against the far wall. I stopped breathing. I tightened my grip on the blade, looking from the bones to my small knife. I didn't feel safe. I backed out slowly, reached into my pack, and pulled out my heavy hitter, a bright red fire axe. I'd scavenged it from an old firebox back in my neighborhood and spent hours sharpening the edge until it could shave hair. With the axe in hand, I felt a surge of confidence. I stepped back into the room with the skeleton. The layout was the same as the last room, but beneath the bones, the floor was stained a dark, brownish black. It looked like the remains of rotted flesh. I leaned forward and poked the skeleton with the head of my axe. With a dull thud, the skull popped off and rolled across the floor. I jumped back, waiting. Nothing happened. I forced myself to look closer. The bones were a sickly dark gray. Ribs were scattered everywhere, and some were snapped clean in half. Then I noticed something chilling. There were no leg bones. Only one arm remained. I squinted, and my stomach churned. There were marks on the ribs. Tiny, jagged indentations. I picked one up to be sure. My family was poor growing up, and we didn't get meat often. When we had ribs, my brothers and I would gnaw them until they were polished clean, leaving behind clear teeth marks. These were human teeth marks. Someone had eaten this person. The thought made my skin crawl. To leave marks on raw bone like that, you'd need incredible strength, or you'd have to cook the body first. I took a long, shaky breath. I couldn't think about that. Whoever did this was likely long gone. I used my axe to smash the rest of the skeleton into splinters. I'd heard stories of skeleton soldiers rising from the dead, and I wasn't taking any chances. Better safe than sorry. I checked the final room. It was empty. I dragged a rickety sofa in front of the main entrance to act as a barricade. Since I couldn't close the iron door without making a racket, this would have to be my early warning system. Finally, I sat down to inspect my gear. The spatial rift had taken my tent and some supplies, but the survival kit Rin Zhenyang gave me was still there. I had enough food if I rationed it. I cleared the trash off the floor, planning to sleep on the hard ground. The bed was too disgusting to touch. I leaned back against my pack and let out a sigh. I had a temporary safe house. If I stayed smart and stayed hidden, I could survive until it was time to go home. I closed my eyes and focused. Deep in my mind, I could feel a faint glimmer, a beacon. That was my ticket back to Earth. It was weak now, but the books said once it felt solid enough to crush, I could return. Suddenly, a strange sensation washed over me. It started in my head and raced through my limbs. It grew stronger and stronger until my brain felt like mush. My vision spun. It felt like I'd been shoved into a washing machine on high speed. Despite the nausea, I wanted to scream with joy. This was it. The awakening. I was gaining a supernatural physique. I gripped my fire axe with what was left of my consciousness. I stared at the door, teeth clenched, refusing to make a sound even as the world turned upside down. When I finally came to, my head was throbbing. I tasted copper. Blood. I panicked, pulling some tissues from my bag to wipe my face. In a place like this, the smell of blood was a death sentence. I sealed the bloody tissues in a plastic bag to hide the scent. I stood up and stretched. I felt different. My muscles felt denser, my grip tighter. I was stronger, way stronger. My body felt lighter, as if a heavy weight had been stripped from my bones. My senses were sharper than they'd ever been, and my mind felt incredibly clear. It was like a fog had lifted, leaving me feeling faster, stronger, and honestly, a lot smarter. There was no doubt about it. The awakening was a success. I was Hualing now, and I was something more than human. I wanted to throw my head back and laugh, to scream with the pure adrenaline of it all, but I caught myself. I was still in the spirit realm. Making noise here was a death wish. I bit back the urge, clenching my jaw until it ached. Suddenly, a sharp sting pierced my forehead. I blinked, and a semi-transparent virtual panel shimmered into existence right in front of my eyes. I nearly jumped out of my skin. What the hell was this? I focused on the floating text, reading through the lines. Name: Hualing bloodline. Human. Strength, 1.3. Constitution, 1.1. Agility, 1.1. Mental power, 2.1. Skills, 5. Potential points, 0. I stared at the numbers, trying to make sense of them. If a normal adult's stats were a baseline of 1.0, then my awakening had definitely given me an edge. My physical stats were all above average, but my mental power was over double the norm. That was huge. It meant I had the potential to become a caster. The panel was useful, but it was distracting. I couldn't imagine trying to fight or even walk around with this thing blocking my vision. I wished it would just go away. The moment the thought crossed my mind, the panel vanished. "Come back," I whispered in my head. It reappeared instantly. I smiled. This was perfect. I didn't know where it came from, but having a way to track my progress in real time was a massive advantage. I still wasn't sure what potential points were for, but I figured I'd find out eventually. I grabbed my fire axe and stood up. I needed to be sure I was actually safe. I cracked the door open and checked the apartment, then crept into the hallway to scan the stairs. I checked up and down, looking for any sign that the smell of my blood or the noise of my transformation had drawn in any predators. The building was silent. Nothing was lurking in the shadows, at least for now. I retreated back into my room and barricaded the door again. My stomach growled, reminding me I hadn't eaten. I pulled out a pack of compressed biscuits, sliced off a piece with my knife, and chewed slowly. While I ate, I closed my eyes to check the mental beacon. The beacon was still charging, but I noticed something else floating right next to it in my mind. It looked like a book. My heart skipped a beat. This was a spirit realm blessing. I'd read about this. When people from Earth successfully awaken here, a lucky few receive a gift from the will of the spirit realm. Some get rare resources, but others get a legacy, a path to power. Most of the high-level techniques back on Earth came from lucky survivors like this. Was I really that lucky? I focused my mind on the book and thought, manifest. With a soft pop, a physical book materialized out of thin air and hovered before me. My breath hitched. This was a legacy tailored specifically for my body. I reached out and grabbed it. The cover was marked with strange characters I didn't recognize, yet somehow, the spirit realm translated them directly into my brain. Alec's spellbook. So, I had inherited the path of a mage named Alec. Usually, warriors or knights get weapons or armor they can meditate on. Casters get spellbooks or journals. A spellbook was the jackpot because it contained the accumulated knowledge of a mage's entire life. I flipped the cover open. The first page was packed with dense, complicated script that made my head swim. I took a deep breath and focused. It was a meditation technique called Breath of Darkness. Darkness? I frowned. I like to think of myself as a pretty bright, upbeat guy. Why was the spirit realm pushing me toward the dark arts? I felt a little slighted, but I kept reading. The next section was filled with spells, or cantrips, as the book called them. They were the basic tools of a spirit realm mage. The first was Gray Mist. It was an area of effect spell that created a cloud of gray fog to block line of sight. It didn't deal damage, but it was a perfect escape tool. The book dedicated 3 whole pages to it. One for the rune, one for the technique, and one for Alec's personal notes and analysis. The second was Bone Tooth. This one was offensive. It used mana to conjure a sharp tooth made of bone that shot toward enemies with high kinetic energy. The range was my mental power multiplied by 25 meters. With my 2.1 stat, I could hit something over 50 meters away. Now we were talking. The third was Langur Touch. It summoned a ghostly tentacle that drained an enemy's energy, making them exhausted. I tried to flip further, but the pages wouldn't budge. They felt like they were made of solid steel. I realized my current strength was only enough to access the meditation and these 3 cantrips. To see the rest, I'd have to actually start practicing. I flipped back to the first page to study the Breath of Darkness more closely. As I read Alec's notes, my eyes widened. This wasn't just some basic manual. This was a gold-tier meditation technique. Back on Earth, legacies were ranked: iron, silver, gold, jade, and legendary. Most people were lucky to find iron or silver. Gold-tier techniques were incredibly rare, and anything higher was stuff of legends that commoners like me weren't even allowed to hear about. I looked at the book again, my hands trembling slightly. Darkness attribute, I muttered, a grin spreading across my face. Who cares? I love the darkness. I was born for the shadows. Anything else would just make me cough. Gold tier, this is amazing. I spent the next several hours memorizing every single word, every diagram, and every one of Alec's personal tips. I wasn't just reading, I was absorbing it. If I wanted to survive long enough to go home, I needed to master this. I sat on the cold floor, closed my eyes, and took my first breath of the dark. I started my first meditation session. I recalled the steps Alec had laid out in the manual and found the most comfortable position I could. I closed my eyes and let time slip away. About half an hour later, I snapped my eyes open. I was stunned. Was I some kind of genius? I had actually succeeded on my very first try. I could feel the mana I'd just absorbed circulating through my body. It felt incredible. A small smile crept across my face as I summoned my attribute panel to see if anything had changed. Name: Hualing. Race: human. Rank: Spirit Apprentice. Strength: 1.3. Physique: 1.1. Agility: 1.1. Spirit: 2.1. Mana: 1.7. Skills: Breath of Darkness. Beginner. Potential points: 0. The panel had updated. I finally had a rank: Spirit Apprentice. It seemed that successfully meditating was the true threshold for stepping into the supernatural realm. I also had a new stat for mana. It wasn't high yet, but I could feel that it had room to grow. Seeing the progress made my heart race. Having a system panel was a massive advantage. Most people give up on cultivation because they can't see immediate results, but I could track every tiny improvement. It kept me hungry. I stood up and stretched, feeling refreshed. I peeked out the window. The sky was fading into a bruised purple. In less than an hour, it would be pitch black. Since I didn't see any immediate danger, I sat back down. I was like a kid with a shiny new toy. I wanted to meditate every second I could. By the time I finished my second round, I checked the panel again. My mana had jumped to 2.1. It seemed my mana capacity was directly linked to my spirit stat. It was a shame I hadn't learned any actual spells yet. I had all this fuel, but no way to light the fire. Suddenly, a sound drifted up from the street. It was getting louder. My face went pale. I stood up carefully, gripping my fire axe until my knuckles turned white. I crept toward the drafty window and looked down. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. Below me, a massive horde of creatures was stumbling down the road. They were Xingshi, executioners. I recognized them from a book I'd skimmed called the Encyclopedia of the Spirit Realm. Executioners were mindless husks. When a world falls into the spirit realm, the inhabitants who can't handle the corruption turn into these things. They lose their minds, but they gain the ability to absorb mana. As long as they aren't killed, they can live for centuries. Some even grow to the size of giants. I cursed myself for not reading that book more carefully. Every world produced different types of executioners. Some could see, some could hear, and some had a sense of smell that could track you for miles. Looking at them, I finally understood the skeleton in the next room. That poor soul had probably been discovered by these things. Executioners might live on mana, but they are bloodthirsty predators. If anything living enters their territory, it becomes a meal. Those teeth marks on the bones made perfect sense now. There were at least 1,000 of them down there, a long, ragged line stretching down the street. They were mostly blind because they were sensitive to light. During the day, they hid in the shadows, but at night, they swarmed toward any sound they heard. I was on the 4th floor, so as long as I stayed quiet, I was relatively safe. I didn't dare move. I didn't even dare to breathe loudly. If I had made a sound while they were passing, they wouldn't be stumbling along like zombies. The books said that when executioners hunt, they move as fast as a sprinting athlete. The older they were, the stronger they got. Most only lived 100 years, but the lucky ones who absorbed enough mana could reach iron, silver, or even gold ranks. A powerful mage once wrote about barely escaping a horde that contained gold-tier executioners. They were just animals, but animals with that kind of power were nightmare fuel. I waited in the dark, frozen. It took a long time for the 1,000-strong horde to shuffle past. Only when the last of them disappeared into the distance did I finally let out the breath I'd been holding. My muscles were screaming from the tension. I was safe for now, but the night was just beginning. The silence that followed was heavy and exhausting. My body finally gave in, and I slumped down onto my supply bag. I wanted to meditate to recover my strength, but I didn't dare. Meditation put me in a vulnerable state where I'd be blind to the world around me. In a place like this, being unaware for even a second was a death sentence. I couldn't sleep either. The adrenaline was still humming in my veins. I leaned against the window frame, using the faint, silvery moonlight to read the magic book Rin Zhengyang had given me. It was time to study the 3 spirit realm spells recorded inside: Gray Matter, Bone Tooth, and Point of Fatigue. I focused on Bone Tooth first. It was the only offensive spell in the trio. In this hostile world, having a way to fight back was more important than anything else. The spell didn't require many runes, but memorizing them was a nightmare. I didn't have a teacher to guide me. I only had the book. According to the text, a typical apprentice takes a week or 2 just to get the hang of a single trick. Even then, they might fail the casting. True mastery, the kind you can rely on in a fight, takes months of constant practice. Luckily, failing a spell didn't cause a magical backlash that would blow my head off. If it did, most mages would die before they ever finished school. The real problem was time. A normal casting took about 3 seconds. In a life-or-death struggle, 3 seconds was an eternity. A fast enemy could gut me twice in that time. The goal was to compress the casting down to 1 second or less, making it instinctive. At the apprentice level, casters like me are at our weakest. Our spells lack punch, we fail often, and our mana pools are tiny. This is the only time physical warriors have the upper hand. A warrior at this level can use their internal energy, their battle chi, to buff their bodies and tear a mage apart. Even if they run out of energy, their muscles are still weapons. But as a mage grows, the gap widens. A master mage is a god. While a high-level warrior just learns to swing a sword harder, a high-level mage can fly, teleport across dimensions, summon monsters, and even resurrect the dead. They call mages grandfathers in the spirit realm because, compared to everyone else, they are at the top of the food chain. I stared at the pages until my eyes burned. The street outside remained quiet. No more executioners passed by. Eventually, the exhaustion became too much to fight. I didn't know what dangers the daylight would bring, and I couldn't face them if I was a walking zombie. I curled up, hoping I didn't snore loud enough to attract a monster, and drifted off. I woke up to thin sunlight hitting my face. I had survived my first night. I stood up, stretched my aching limbs, and ate a quick meal from my rations. The second day in the spirit realm had begun. I spent the entire morning back in the book. There were no shortcuts. I spent hours visualizing the runes, sketching them in my mind over and over. I even had to get creative when nature called, finding a separate room and burying my waist under piles of debris to hide my scent. I wasn't taking any chances. Around noon, a shuffling sound drifted up from the street. Not again, I whispered. I crept to the window and peered out. At the end of the road, I saw green figures moving through the ruins. I squinted, my heart racing. They were goblins. These things were everywhere in the spirit realm. They stood about 4 feet tall, with sickly green skin. They weren't very smart, maybe as bright as a 7-year-old, but they were nasty. Goblins are cowards when they're alone, but they get incredibly bold when they have numbers on their side. If a tribe gets big enough, they can even produce their own warriors and shamans. I counted them carefully. There were 6 of them. They were scavenging, poking through the trash and rubble, heading right toward my building. The goblins hadn't noticed me yet. I stayed low, keeping only my eyes above the windowsill. They were mostly naked, except for the leader. He had a necklace made of woven grass and messy bird feathers dangling around his neck. They were all carrying spears, nearly 2 meters long. The tips weren't metal. They were jagged pieces of sharp stone lashed to crooked wooden poles with grass rope. Their gear was primitive. It told me their tribe probably wasn't very large or advanced. They marched down the street, shouting and hooting at the top of their lungs. It didn't make sense. Their combat power was low, so why were they making so much noise? Weren't they afraid of attracting predators? They swung their stone spears, banging them against the crumbling walls and laughing in a guttural language I couldn't understand. Suddenly, the group split up. They paired off and started entering the surrounding buildings. A cold pit formed in my stomach. Why were they coming inside? I didn't wait to find out. I grabbed my fire axe and tucked my short knife into my belt. I watched from the shadows, my heart hammering against my ribs. 10 minutes later, one pair emerged from a nearby building carrying a rusted iron pot and some random scraps. They were scavenging. My pulse quickened as the other pairs came out with their own hauls. They dropped the loot in a pile and then picked new buildings to search. I closed my eyes for a second, praying. Please, not this building. Just skip this one. My prayers went unanswered. Two goblins walked out of the apartment across the street, empty-handed and swearing in their raspy tongue. They turned and headed straight for my front door. My blood ran cold. I didn't want this fight. I had just successfully undergone my awakening. I had the spirit realm's blessing and a status panel I barely understood yet. If I could just get back to Earth, I had a future as a powerful mage. I had everything to lose. But the threat was coming whether I liked it or not. A single goblin wasn't much of a threat. They stood about 4 feet tall, with the physical strength of a 12-year-old human. But they were vicious. They were the kind of cowards who became reckless when they had backup. The sound of their gibberish grew louder. They were inside the building now. I forced myself to breathe, calming my nerves. There was no use hiding anymore. It was time to fight for my life. I was bigger and stronger than them, especially after my awakening. If I could take these two out quickly, I might stand a chance against the other 4 outside. I retreated behind the door and gripped my fire axe with both hands. I felt the new strength flowing through my muscles. I reversed my grip on the short knife in my left hand, ready for anything. I had blocked the entrance with an old, rotting sofa, but it didn't stop them. They shoved it aside with a grunt. The old fabric tore, sending a cloud of dust and debris into the air that made the goblins cough. I heard them checking the other rooms first. They must have found the skeleton I smashed earlier because they stopped to chatter for a moment. Then, the hinges groaned. My door pushed open. The stench hit me first, a sour, rancid smell of creatures that had never seen a bath. I held my breath, pressing myself against the wall. Jikagula, one of them shrieked. They had spotted my backpack and the pile of food and tools in the corner. They cackled, their backs turned to me as they gloated over their find. One of them was holding a pile of junk he'd found earlier. He had even balanced the top of the human skull from the other room on his head like a sick trophy. The other one held a stone spear, his eyes fixed on my supplies. I didn't give them a second to react. I stepped out from behind the door, my face twisted in a snarl. I swung the fire axe in a brutal, diagonal arc. I had spent hours sharpening that blade, and it didn't let me down. The axe bit deep into the neck of the goblin holding the spear. There was a sickening crunch as it hit bone. Green blood sprayed across the room. The creature didn't even have time to scream before it slumped to the floor, dead. The second goblin froze, staring at its partner. I put my foot on the dead one's chest and yanked the axe free. That's when the survivor finally found its voice and shrieked. I didn't give it a chance to run. I raised the axe high and swung again. The goblin didn't have a weapon, so it desperately threw up its hands, trying to use the pile of junk it was carrying as a shield. The axe smashed through the debris and slammed into the creature's shoulder. It wasn't a killing blow, but the force of it sent the goblin flying backward onto the wooden bed. Before it could scramble away, I lunged. I brought the axe down right between its eyes. The goblin's skull split open. Green blood and white brain matter splattered against the wall. Its body gave one final twitch and went still. I stood there, gasping for air. My lungs burned. Even though I had won, the adrenaline dump left my limbs feeling like lead. This was the difference between training and reality. I'd practiced combat in school, but I'd never actually seen blood, unless you counted gutting a fish at a restaurant. This was different. This was raw. I stepped onto the creaking bed, the wood groaning under my weight. I gripped the handle and pulled the axe out of the goblin's head. As the life faded from its eyes, something strange happened. A tiny, faint orb of light emerged from the corpse and shot straight into my chest. I jumped back, startled, but it disappeared into my skin before I could move. I checked my hands and my chest. Nothing felt different. No pain, no weird tingling. I didn't know what that light was, but I didn't have time to worry about it. There were still 4 more of them outside. I didn't have time to worry about that weird light. If I wanted to stay alive, I had to move. I grabbed the goblin's sack and stuffed the scavenged food and tools inside. Luckily, the bag was clean. I stashed it in a different room for a moment. I had 4 more monsters to deal with, and I needed a better plan. I went back to the corpse and picked up its stone spear. Using my short blade, I cut the ropes and tossed the blunt stone tip aside. I needed reach. I lashed my own sharp blade to the wooden pole instead. In a fight, an extra inch of reach is an extra inch of life. A long-handled weapon would give me the edge I needed. My curved blade was razor-sharp, much better than a jagged rock. I crouched by the window, keeping one eye on the remaining 2 pairs of goblins while I tightened the grass ropes. It didn't take long. I had a new spear, and it was far deadlier than anything these creatures carried. I grabbed the spear and my fire axe and slipped out of the room. I hurried downstairs and moved toward the next building where the second group was searching. Just as I reached the stairwell, I heard them. They were chattering in their foul language, heading down. I didn't have time to climb. I ducked into the shadows beneath the first-floor stairs. It was pitch black under there. If they weren't looking for me, they wouldn't see me. The 2 goblins shuffled down the steps, one after the other, carrying armfuls of junk. I took a slow, deep breath. I let the first one pass. In an ambush, you always hit the one in the back. As the second goblin stepped off the last stair, I lunged out. I gripped the 2-meter spear with both hands and thrust with everything I had. The blade tore through the creature's chest. Blood sprayed across the floor. The goblin let out a choked groan, staring down at the steel sticking out of its sternum. The sound alerted the one in front. He spun around and saw me, a tall, shadow-drenched human looming over his dying comrade. I kicked the dying goblin off my blade and leveled the spear at the survivor. The creature shrieked. It was so terrified it dropped its loot and its own spear. It turned to bolt. I wasn't going to let it. I took 3 long strides and ran it through from behind. I pulled the spear out, and the goblin collapsed, clutching its chest and coughing up blood. I didn't feel a thing. I couldn't afford to. The last 2 goblins in the opposite building had heard the noise. They were outside now. The first 4 were easy because I had the element of surprise. These 2 were ready. They gripped their spears and barked at me, trying to intimidate me or maybe just whistling in the dark. I exhaled, tightening my grip on my spear. I bent my knees, settling into a low stance. This was it. A real, face-to-face fight. No more hiding. The 2 goblins began to circle me. They were trying to split up, looking for an opening to get behind me. I knew I couldn't wait. If I let them flank me, I was dead. I let out a roar to steel my nerves. The sound startled them. In that split second, I lunged at the one directly in front of me. The goblin's primal instincts kicked in, and it charged back. But it was barely 4 feet tall. I had the height, the reach, and the training. I used a parry technique I'd practiced 1,000 times, flicking my spear to knock his weapon aside. Then I thrust. The blade sank into its shoulder. The goblin screamed in agony and did something I didn't expect. It grabbed the shaft of my spear with both hands. I pulled, but it wouldn't let go. It was shrieking for its companion to help. I didn't hesitate. I let go of the spear and grabbed the fire axe hanging at my waist. The goblin's eyes went wide as I swung. The axe blade caught it right in the neck, nearly severing its head. It slumped over, dead before it hit the ground. Another faint orb of light drifted out of its body and sank into me. The last goblin watched its friend die and lost its nerve. Goblins are like monkeys, brave when they have numbers, but cowards when they're alone. It dropped its spear and ran. By the time I turned, it was already 10 meters away. I couldn't let it escape. If it led a whole tribe back here, I was finished. I stepped on the dead goblin's chest, ripped my spear free, and gave chase. The little monster was fast. Realizing I wouldn't catch it on foot, I leaned back and hurled the spear with every bit of strength I possessed. The spear arched through the air and slammed into the goblin's thigh. It went down, howling. It tried to pull the blade out of its bone, but it was too deep. I caught up in seconds. I raised the axe and ended it. The battle was over, but I couldn't stay. I was drenched in sweat and blood. I stripped off my blood-stained outer jacket, leaving only my protective vest. I grabbed my gear and started walking down the road. 6 dead goblins and the smell of fresh blood would act like a dinner bell for every predator in this city. I was exhausted, my muscles were screaming, and my stamina was bottoming out. If more showed up now, I didn't know if I'd win. I walked for half an hour until I found another apartment building. I scouted the rooms, found one that looked secure, and barricaded myself inside. I cleared away the dust and collapsed onto my bag. My heart was still racing. Thinking back on the fight, a cold shiver ran down my spine. I had survived by the skin of my teeth. If I hadn't taken most of them out by surprise, I'd be the one rotting on the pavement right now. I started thinking back to the heat of the battle. When 2 of those goblins died, I noticed faint specks of light floating toward me. At the time, I was too busy staying alive to care. Now, I checked my body, but I didn't see anything different. I focused my mind and called up my attribute panel. It had changed. Name, Hualing race, human. Rank, spirit apprentice. Strength, 1.3. Constitution, 1.1. Agility, 1.1. Spirit, 2.1. Mana, 21/21. Skills, meditation of the dark breath. Potential points, 2. My potential points had been at 0. Now I had 2. Where did they come from? It had to be the goblins. But I killed 6 of them, and only 2 gave me points. Why? I tried to dump the points into my strength or agility, but nothing happened. I couldn't wrap my head around it. I decided to set the mystery aside for a moment. My stomach growled. I was starving. I pulled out a pack of compressed biscuits and started chewing. I forced myself not to eat until I was full. If I ate too much after that much physical exertion, I'd get drowsy. In this place, falling into a deep sleep was a death sentence. After resting for a bit, I leaned against the window to keep an ear on the street. I pulled out my magic book. I needed to keep studying the spell Bone Tooth. Suddenly, the attribute panel popped up on its own with a new prompt. Use potential points to accelerate learning? My heart skipped a beat. So that's what they were for. I didn't hesitate. I clicked yes. The panel vanished, and I looked down at the book. It was incredible. It felt like a bucket of ice water had been poured over my head, clearing away every bit of mental fog. The runes that looked like gibberish minutes ago now seemed as simple as basic math. If learning magic before was like a grade schooler trying to solve advanced calculus, now it was like an adult doing simple addition. I didn't dare waste a second. I dove into the text, soaking up the knowledge while the boost lasted. By the time the sun began to dip below the horizon, the golden glow of the potential points faded. I snapped out of my trance-like state, but the progress I'd made was massive. I closed my eyes and visualized the magical runes in my mind. 3 seconds later, a sharp, white tooth the size of a peanut materialized, hovering in the air beside me. Bone Tooth. I had done it. I flicked my wrist. The tooth whistled through the air, breaking the sound barrier. It slammed into a building 30 meters across the street. Boom! A hole the size of a human head appeared in the concrete wall. It didn't punch all the way through, but the damage was terrifying. If that hit a goblin's skull, it would pop like a melon. My range was limited by my spirit attribute, about 52 meters. For an apprentice, that was plenty. I checked my panel again. Mana, 18/21. Skills, meditation of the dark breath, Bone Tooth, spirit grade. Potential points, 0. One shot cost 3 mana. That meant I could only fire 7 times before I was tapped out. Still, I finally had a ranged attack. If I'd had this during the ambush, I could have sniped those goblins from the shadows without ever getting blood on my hands. I pushed my spirit outward, scanning the ruins within a 50-meter radius. I didn't find any threats. This was a new trick I'd picked up after mastering my first spell. It made scouting so much easier. I didn't have to run up and down stairs anymore. I could just feel the building. The downside was the drain. A few minutes of scanning dropped my spirit from 2.1 to 1.9. If I kept it on full blast, I'd be exhausted in half an hour. Spirit recovered much slower than mana, even with meditation. I knew I couldn't get cocky. One spell didn't make me invincible. If a whole tribe of goblins or a pack of those shadow lions found me, a few bone teeth wouldn't save me. I leaned back against the wall near the window. I entered a state of shallow meditation. In shallow meditation, I could recover my energy while remaining aware of my surroundings. Deep meditation was faster, but it left me deaf and blind to the world. I couldn't afford that luxury anymore. The mana flowed through my veins, washing away the physical fatigue of the day. It was better than sleep. I sat there in the dark, a silent sentry in a dead city. As the night grew deeper, the silence of the streets was broken. A soft, skittering sound rose from the shadows. Something was moving out there. I peered through the cracked window, searching for the source of the noise. I couldn't see a thing in the pitch-black street. Then I remembered my new advantage. I had spirit now. I closed my eyes and smiled, pushing my mental scan outward. I found it almost instantly in the building diagonally across from me. It was a rat. A small, scrawny thing scurrying through the dust. I was genuinely surprised. I knew the shadow lions were here, But I didn't expect to find normal wildlife in a dead city. The lions were different. They didn't have intelligence, but they instinctively absorbed mana from the spirit realm to keep their bodies functioning. This rat didn't have that ability. How was it even surviving here? Before I could figure it out, a faint, rhythmic tapping reached my ears. I looked up. Another pack of shadow lions was approaching. These things rarely traveled alone. Their hearing was incredibly sensitive, so they would naturally gravitate toward any sound, including the footsteps of their own kind. To their ears, a comrade's footfall sounded no different from prey. One lion starts moving, others follow, and soon you have a horde that just keeps growing. I held my breath as they passed below. This place really was a lion city in every sense of the word. They ruled the night. I stayed frozen, making no sound, but the rat wasn't so careful. It kept darting around, letting out tiny, high-pitched squeaks. I felt a grim smile tug at my lips. That rat was dead meat. Sure enough, the lead lions in a pack nearly 100 meters away froze. They tilted their pale, gaunt heads, ears twitching as they locked onto the sound. A second later, they lunged. They were naked and skeletal, but their frames were corded with lean muscle. Because they never saw the sun, their skin was a ghostly, translucent white. When they ran, they looked like white streaks, pale ghosts flying through the dark. The leaders triggered a chain reaction. The lions behind them caught the excitement and began to sprint. The sound was deafening. Thud, thud, thud. A literal stampede of monsters. The terrified rat turned tail and bolted for its nest inside the building. I used my spirit to track the chase. The rat scrambled up a staircase railing, squeaking in pure terror. Right behind it, the heavy feet of the lion slammed onto the concrete, kicking up clouds of ancient dust. The poor thing didn't make it past the first landing. A pale hand snatched it out of the air. There was one final, sharp scream, and then silence. A mouth full of rotting, yellow teeth clamped down. The lion shoved the rat inside, leaving only the tail hanging out. Crunch. I could practically hear the bones snapping and the flesh tearing. A spray of blood hit the floor. Another lion dropped to its knees, greedily licking the red stains off the dusty stairs. I pulled back from the window, my heart hammering against my ribs. That was terrifying. Usually, these things moved like senile old men, shuffling one slow step at a time. But the moment they found a target, they turned into Olympic sprinters. If one of them spotted me, I wouldn't stand a chance. I couldn't outrun them. If I was found, I was dead. I sat in the dark, refusing to move a muscle. I used my spirit to check the street every few minutes. The pack had settled into a restless huddle, hundreds of them crammed together, shoulder to shoulder. Eventually, they began to drift apart, resuming their slow trek down the road. I finally let out a long, shaky breath. The pressure of having hundreds of man-eaters right outside my door was suffocating. I hadn't even dared to let myself get too nervous, fearing they might hear my racing heartbeat or smell the sweat on my skin. An hour passed before the street finally cleared. I wiped a hand across my forehead, drying the cold sweat that felt like it was pouring off me. I had underestimated them. That pack was considered small, only a few hundred, and none of them seemed to be at the black iron rank. I couldn't imagine how horrific a horde of tens of thousands would be. The night wasn't over yet. The scent of rat blood and the noise of the chase were like a beacon. I went back into a shallow meditation to rest, but I was constantly interrupted. Small groups of 10, medium packs of hundreds, one massive swarm of at least 3,000. They just kept coming. Some passed by, but others, drawn by the lingering scent of blood, climbed into the building across the street to investigate. I realized then that I had to move as soon as the sun came up. I couldn't handle this stress. If a single rat could cause this much chaos, what about the 6 goblin corpses I'd left behind yesterday? To the lions, that was a feast. As dawn approached, the sky began to turn gray. My stomach dropped. A pack of about 50 lions was still lingering in the street below. They had traveled a long way and were moving slowly. A few of them caught the scent and started wandering into the nearby buildings. The worst-case scenario was happening. They could sense the light changing. They weren't going to keep walking. They were looking for a place to hide from the sun. I prayed they wouldn't pick my building. But the universe wasn't listening. The sun finally began its slow crawl over the horizon. Faint rays of light spilled across the cracked pavement, hitting the bodies of the lingering lions. They tilted their heads back, letting out low, guttural hisses. The sunlight didn't seem to physically hurt them, but they clearly loathed it. One by one, they began to shuffle away, their movements stiff and clumsy as they retreated into the buildings lining the street. My heart hammered against my ribs. A few of them had wandered right into the ground floor of the building I was hiding in. I froze. I didn't even dare to breathe too loudly, terrified that the slightest noise would draw them up the stairs. I was lucky I'd chosen a higher floor. For now, they seemed content to stay on the first and second levels. I couldn't afford to be stingy with my mental energy anymore. I pushed my perception outward to scan the building. There were 5 of them in total. 2 were lurking on the first floor, and 3 had settled on the second. I crouched there, weighing my options. Should I stay put and wait for nightfall? Maybe they'd just leave on their own once the sun went down. I shook my head, dismissing the thought immediately. Waiting was too unpredictable. Who knew if they'd decide to wander up to the 4th floor in an hour? Waiting until night was even worse. That would be handing my fate over to them on a silver platter. I thought about using the rope in my survival kit to rappel down from the window. It was a solid plan in theory, but the reality was grim. I scanned the room for an anchor point. Everything was rotten. The furniture was falling apart, and the window frames were nothing but rusted, brittle skeletons. There wasn't a single thing in here that could hold my weight, let alone the strain of a descent. I let out a long, quiet sigh. There was only one way out. I had to fight. I sat down slowly and closed my eyes. Every few minutes, I used my mental sense to track the lines below. As the sun climbed higher, the beasts retreated further into the shadows, tucking themselves into the darkest corners of the rooms where the light couldn't reach. I realized that if I was careful, if I didn't make a single sound, I might be able to slip past them in the hallway. But luck wasn't on my side. One of the lions had decided to park itself right on the landing between the 1st and 2nd floors. It was blocking the only way down. I waited an hour. It didn't move. I knew I couldn't wait any longer. The longer I sat here, the more things could go wrong. I tightened the straps of my backpack and gripped my makeshift spear. I took a deep breath, grabbed my fire axe, and stepped out of the room on tiptoe. I wasn't the helpless person I used to be. I had magic now. It was a shame my bone fong spell traveled in a straight line. If it could curve, I could have sniped them all from the top of the stairs. My mental scan showed that the lions were in a sort of trance. Their eyes were closed, and they were keeping their movements to a minimum to save energy. They only shifted when a stray beam of sunlight touched their skin. I crept down the stairs. When I reached the 3rd floor, I peered through the gaps in the banister. I could see the lion huddled in the stairwell below. The building's design featured windows on both sides of the stairs to let in natural light. Now, that light was my best friend. The sun was streaming in from above and below, pinning the beast into one tiny, shaded corner. I wasn't going to get any closer. I focused my mind, sketching the familiar rune in my head. 3 seconds later, a sharp, white bone fong shimmered into existence beside me. I launched it. The projectile hissed through the air. The lion's ears twitched. It heard the sound, but it wasn't fast enough to react. The bone fong slammed directly into its skull. There was a wet thud. The creature's head practically exploded. Thick blood and brain matter sprayed against the wall, and the heavy scent of copper filled the stairwell. I froze, holding my breath. I pushed my mental scan to its limit, watching the other lions in the building. They definitely heard the noise. They definitely smelled the blood. But they didn't open their eyes. They didn't even move. A surge of relief washed over me. It looked like these things were barely a threat during the day as long as the sun was out. Then, something strange happened. A tiny speck of light drifted out from the dead lion's body and sank into my chest. My eyes widened. Did killing these things give me potential points? I pulled up my status panel immediately. Name: Hualing Mana, 1821st. Skills: Breath of Darkness Meditation, Bone Fong. Potential points: 0.5. It worked. I had gained 0.5 points. I felt a rush of excitement. Potential points were the most valuable thing I had in this world. One lion only gave half a point, less than a goblin, probably because they weren't intelligent. I looked toward the rooms where the other lions were hiding. Suddenly, those ugly, vicious monsters looked like bags of gold. I could see the points waving at me. I shook the thought away. Greed would get me killed. I wasn't out of the woods yet, and I couldn't risk my life for a few measly points. If I stayed alive, there would be plenty of chances to hunt later. I forced myself to move. I crept down the remaining stairs, careful not to make a sound. I stepped over the dead lion, making sure not to get any blood on my boots, and slipped out of the building. Once outside, I changed direction. I wanted to stay far away from the path the main pride had taken last night. If my theory was right, those hundreds of lions were all hiding in the buildings along that street. Walking that way would be suicide. I headed back toward the direction I'd come from the day before, hoping to find a new place to hunker down. But this world never makes things easy. I'd only gone a few steps when I heard a familiar chatter. I dropped to one knee, tilting my head to listen. My blood ran cold. It was the sound of goblins. Had they tracked me? Had they followed my trail from yesterday to get revenge for their fallen scouts? It didn't seem possible. With all the lions roaming around last night, my scent should have been completely covered. There was no time to wonder. I didn't even care about being quiet anymore. I turned and bolted. The area was crawling with lions, but since they wouldn't come out in the sun, it was actually the safest place to run. I sprinted 100 meters and glanced back. A line of green figures appeared at the far end of the street. I stopped running. If I kept going in the open, they'd spot me for sure. I used my mental sense to find a building that was empty of lions. I scrambled through a shattered first-floor window and climbed as fast as I could. I didn't stop until I reached the 4th floor, ducking into a room and pressing my back against the wall, praying they hadn't seen me. I crept toward the window, keeping my head low as I peered down at the street. My heart hammered against my ribs. There were way more of them than yesterday. I counted at least 20 goblins. They were loud, arrogant, and incredibly annoying. They chattered nonstop in a high-pitched, garbled language, shoving and play-fighting with each other as they marched. I noticed several of them wearing those feathered grass necklaces now. That meant there were multiple leaders or veterans in this group. I stayed frozen. I didn't dare make a sound. There was no way I could take on 20 of them. As a fledgling apprentice mage, my Bonfang spell had a 3-second cooldown. Even if they stood perfectly still and let me shoot them, I'd only manage to kill 7 before they swarmed me. In a melee fight, 3 of them would be enough to end me. I pressed myself flatter against the floor, praying they wouldn't look up. The pack moved down the street with strange behavior. They weren't being quiet at all. In fact, they were banging on the walls of the buildings, intentionally making as much noise as possible. Every now and then, a couple of them would disappear into a lobby and come back out a few minutes later. I didn't get it. Why be so reckless in a place this dangerous? Finally, they reached the building where I'd seen the executioner corpses earlier. There were dozens of those pale, dormant monsters hidden in the shadows there. I narrowed my eyes, watching from the 4th floor. I wanted to see what happened when these 2 monsters collided. 2 goblins ducked into a nearby entrance. A moment later, they burst back out, shrieking at the top of their lungs. But they didn't sound scared. They sounded excited. The rest of the pack erupted in cheers. They brandished their crude stone spears and rushed into the building like a mob at a sale. I couldn't see what was happening inside. My mental sense didn't reach that far, but 10 minutes later, they emerged. Their spears were coated in thick, dark blood. They looked triumphant. Then I saw it, and my pupils shrunk. The goblins at the back were working in pairs. They were carrying the executioner corpses out. The monsters were dead, truly dead this time. Their bodies were riddled with spear holes, dripping black ichor onto the pavement. The goblins had tied the corpses' hands and feet to long poles, carrying them out like slaughtered pigs. They didn't stop there. The pack moved from building to building, harvesting the dormant corpses. When they hit the building next to mine, I finally got a clear view using my mental sense. The goblins found a room with 2 executioner corpses. The monsters didn't even open their eyes, even as the goblins laughed and shouted. One goblin stepped forward, a nasty grin on its face, and lunged. The stone spear buried itself deep in the monster's chest. Only then did the executioner corpse snap its eyes open. It flailed its arms wildly, trying to grab its attacker, but it was too late. It couldn't reach the goblin with a spear through its lungs. Another goblin stepped up and finished it off with a thrust to the throat. The second corpse in the room didn't even wake up. Its ears and nose twitched. It clearly heard the noise and smelled the blood, but its body remained locked in that weird daytime trance. It was slaughtered just as easily as the first. Within an hour, the goblins had cleared out a dozen corpses. They shouldered their bloody prizes and began marching back the way they came. Watching them disappear into the distance, I felt a sudden, manic urge to laugh. I'd been so suppressed and terrified in this spirit world, but the answer had been right in front of me. During the day, those terrifying executioner corpses were nothing but sitting ducks. They were practice targets. The goblins had just given me the ultimate survival guide. Potential points, I whispered, a grin spreading across my face. Here I come. I didn't waste time. I grabbed my survival bag, gripped my fire axe in one hand and my spear in the other, and headed for the stairs. I pushed my mental sense to its limit, searching for the nearest signature. I found a room on the second floor of a neighboring block. Inside, 2 executioner corpses stood in a dark corner. Knowing they wouldn't move was one thing. Standing 3 feet away from them was another. I studied them. They looked almost human, just incredibly gaunt and pale, their skin covered in a layer of grime from years of hiding from the sun. I took a deep breath, raised my axe, and stepped into the dark.